The Renaissance Dream, when China swore never to bow before the atomic bomb. August 1945. The world held its breath. Two thunderous explosions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki did more than tear apart two cities. They ripped through the old world order of humankind. From the smoky skies rose the realization of a power unlike any seen before, a power that made war, honor, and morality seem suddenly small. In mere seconds, hundreds of thousands of lives vanished, and the world entered an era in which a single type of weapon would define all power: the atomic bomb. Far away in the east, in a humble room in Yan'an, Mao Zedong, the man dreaming of a unified China after nearly a century of humiliation, quietly stared at a wrinkled newspaper. On it was the image of a giant mushroom cloud rising over Japan. He said nothing, only his eyes spoke, cold, deep, and filled with a vague, simmering anger. The blast at Hiroshima didn't just kill Japanese people. It killed China's ordinary dream, the dream that national liberation and unification alone would earn the country respect. No. After those two bombs, Mao understood. Real power doesn't lie in ideals. It lies in whoever holds nuclear energy in their hands. From that moment, a dangerous seed was sown, a seed of obsession and ambition. For Mao, there was no room for humiliation. Chinese history was a long chain of fragmentation, invasion, and forced submission to foreign empires. The British used opium, the Japanese used guns, the Americans used the atomic bomb. But this time, Mao swore, China would never bow again. In 1949, when the People's Republic of China was born, Beijing was ablaze with fireworks and slogans filling the skies. Yet behind the smoke, a quiet fear lingered, the fear of being humiliated once more. The West saw the new China as a stranger at the global chessboard. The United Nations refused to recognize it. U.S. warships were stationed just off the coast of Taiwan. And across the Korean peninsula, war had erupted, with American B-29 bombers ready to deploy nuclear weapons. Mao knew well, if one day those bombs were to fall on Beijing, no one would come to China's defense. Not the Soviets, not any ally. So he declared, "We need something that will make others think twice before pointing their guns at us." In the early 1950s, China was so poor it couldn't produce enough steel to build large factories. Yet the idea of an atomic bomb quietly began to take shape. In secret meetings and confidential letters, top leaders began asking, "Can we build the atomic bomb?" For them, this wasn't a dream, it was survival. In Beijing, a young physicist named Qian Sanchang, who had studied in Paris and worked alongside Frédéric Joliot-Curie, became a key figure. His mind held the equations of nuclear fission, but his heart burned with national pride. Upon hearing of Hiroshima, he wrote in his diary, "If China does not possess nuclear energy, we will forever live under threat." When the republic was established, Qian returned home. No money, no equipment, only determination. He and a small group of scientists began nuclear research by hand. In a cramped room in Beijing, using outdated instruments. But this was the beginning of the Renaissance dream, a dream not born of optimism, but of desperate will to survive. 1949, China changes color. For the first time, the 5-star red flag flew high above Tiananmen Square. Amid the thunderous shouts of, "China has stood up," the nation seemed to have turned a new page. But behind the cheers, Mao Zedong understood clearly. Standing up was only the beginning, the real question was how not to be pushed down again. The 19th century and the first half of the 20th were open wounds for China. From the Opium Wars to the unequal treaties, from British troops to Japanese soldiers, the nation had been carved up, humiliated, and torn apart by those who claimed to be civilized. Every line in those treaties was like a knife cutting into the heart of national pride. Mao once said, "If we have no power, then morality is nothing but a joke." On long nights in Jiangnan, he would gaze out the window at the dim yellow lights of Beijing. The country was still poor, desperately poor. Many regions had no electricity. People were hungry. But what kept Mao awake was not only the question of food, it was that the dignity of the Chinese nation hung precariously at the mercy of others. The West had the atomic bomb. The Soviet Union had the atomic bomb. Only China, a nation that had once seen itself as the center of the world, stood outside. Powerless. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, that feeling of vulnerability became sharper than ever. As Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River to aid North Korea, Mao fully understood the risks. He once asked his advisors, "If America uses the atomic bomb, what will we do?" No one had an answer. For the first time since the founding of the People's Republic, Mao felt that China could be wiped out with a single order from Washington. Intelligence reports from Manchuria indicated that U.S. nuclear warheads had been moved to Okinawa, only a few hours' flight from the Sino-Korean border. Every day, American B-29 bombers patrolled the skies over Korea, carrying death that could fall at any moment. Mao didn't speak of it openly, but he wrote one line in his notebook: "Without the bomb, we will always be under threat." From that moment, the seed of China's nuclear ambition truly began to sprout. Yet in the early 1950s, the idea of China developing an atomic bomb seemed almost unimaginable. The nation had just emerged from civil war. Industry was in ruins. Over 80% of the population were illiterate peasants. Even producing steel, the most basic material, required collecting citizens' pots and shovels. In such conditions, the thought of refining uranium, designing reactors, or building warheads sounded like pure fantasy. But Mao didn't think so. For him, nothing was impossible when fueled by the fire of national humiliation. He understood that if he could convince the Soviet Union to help, China might leapfrog into the nuclear age. Within the Ministry of Defense, a small, top-secret team of scientists and military officers was ordered to study everything related to special weapons, the code name for the atomic bomb. They pored over anything they could find: Russian translations of publicly available documents, scattered papers on nuclear physics, and even Western newspaper articles about Hiroshima. At the same time, Qian Shuisun, a rocket genius who had worked at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, was under house arrest in the United States on suspicions of espionage. Upon hearing that his homeland had been reborn, he wrote to request repatriation. 5 years later, after tense negotiations, Qian was exchanged for captured American pilots from the Korean War. When he stepped onto the docks of Shanghai in 1955, he carried no weapons, only knowledge and determination. Mao knew that in Qian, China had acquired a priceless gem. From here, China's nuclear blueprint began to take shape. On one side was the unyielding political will of Mao and the leadership. Even if we have to eat grass, we must have the bomb. On the other side was the scientific brilliance of men like Qian Sancheng, Qian Shuisun, and Deng Jiaoshen, young physicists and engineers who believed that knowledge could change the fate of their nation. They met in a unique moment in history, when national pride outweighed the hunger in people's stomachs, and the fear of humiliation was stronger than the fear of starvation. On Qian Sancheng's desk in Beijing, a sheet of paper bearing the equations for uranium fission was clipped alongside a portrait of his mentor, Frédéric Joliot-Curie. In France, Qian knew China was starting from the very beginning, but at least the path forward was clear. And when he heard Mao proclaim the historic words, "Even if we have to eat grass, we must have the atomic bomb, because without it, others will never respect us," Qian knew there was no turning back. Outside, the people still lived in hardship. But inside, a dream was growing day by day, the dream of a China that would no longer be threatened, no longer forced to bow. What they didn't yet realize was that to achieve that dream, the nation would pay with millions of lives, decades of exhaustion, and the faith of an entire people. But for Mao, that was the price of dignity. Winter 1953. Beijing lay frozen under a bitter cold. On snow-covered streets, people still crowded in long lines to receive their meager food rations. In damp brick houses, children burned scraps of coal to keep warm. The country was still far from anything resembling a great power. But inside the smoke-filled rooms of Jiangnan, the leadership was speaking of the atom. The meetings were discreet, often held late at night, under the dim yellow lights. Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Zhu De, and a handful of trusted generals sat around a long table, over which a large map of China was spread. Mao slowly pointed to the northwest, his voice calm but firm. Desert. Vast. Desolate. Sparsely populated. A good place to keep secrets. No one responded, but everyone understood. From that moment, Xinjiang, particularly the Lop Nur region, began to be marked in red on secret maps. It would become the heart of China's nuclear program, even though no one yet knew where to begin. While the leadership discussed grand strategy, in the background, the scientific community quietly began preparing for something even they didn't fully understand. Qian Sancheng gathered a small group around him, young men and women, most of whom had never laid a hand on actual nuclear equipment. All they had were a few old French textbooks, some reprinted European lecture notes, and a shared conviction that they were undertaking the most important task in their nation's history. Their laboratory was housed within the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Day after day, they tinkered with measurements and experiments, even building models of nuclear fission using hand-blown glass tubes and recycled wires from old machines. No one knew if the equations they scribbled on the blackboard would ever lead to an atomic bomb. But they believed that even a single correct step would bring the entire nation closer to standing as an equal among world powers. Yet the scientists understood well, their knowledge was a fragile shell. To truly build a nuclear weapon, they needed what only a great power could provide: experience and technology. And at that time, there was only one plausible source: the Soviet Union. Relations between Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin were uneasy. Both men were proud, each believing himself to be the true standard-bearer of revolution. But Mao knew that to move quickly, he would have to swallow his pride. In 1950, the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance was signed in Moscow. To the public, it was a declaration of comradeship. To Mao, it was a ticket to the nuclear age. Soon after, thousands of Soviet experts began pouring into China: engineers, physicists, and military specialists. They brought with them documents, blueprints, and equipment, from small reactors to radiation detectors. All were transported by train from Siberia to the Manchurian border, sealed in freight cars that no one was allowed to open. On the crates was a single line: energy research equipment. But everyone knew, this was the first drop of nuclear milk China would ever taste. When the first group of Soviet specialists arrived in Beijing, they were received with a mix of respect and curiosity. Chinese scientists, who had previously only known nuclear theory through books, now saw a real reactor for the first time, even if only a small training model. To them, it was like catching a glimpse of the future. The Soviets taught them how to calculate reaction cycles, how to handle uranium, how to control neutrons. Every small detail was recorded meticulously. Every formula was copied by hand. Late into the night, the lights in Beijing's laboratories burned on. Qian Sancheng told his students, "We are learning everything from the beginning, but at least this time, we are learning for ourselves, not to serve others." Mao understood this was only the beginning, but it was a beginning with no turning back. He believed that the atomic bomb was not just a weapon, but a symbol of national power. In his speeches, Mao began to talk about national rejuvenation, about China standing shoulder to shoulder with the great powers. For the first time, he voiced the words that would become the guiding principle of the entire nuclear program. "We do not wish to be threatened. We must have something that makes others fear us." From then on, every path in Chinese science began to converge on one point: the atomic bomb. From scribbled formulas on worn paper, from smoke-filled rooms and dim laboratories, the dream of national renaissance had truly begun. But no one yet understood that behind the light of that first reactor lay the shadows of ambition, isolation, and a race of life and death. To obtain their nuclear talisman, China would have to sacrifice not only money, but the soul of an entire era. Winter 1953. Beijing lay shrouded in a bitter cold. On snow-covered streets, people still crowded in long queues to receive their food rations. In damp brick houses, children burned scraps of coal to keep warm. The country was still a long way from anything resembling a great power. Yet inside the smoke-filled rooms of Jiangnan, The conversation had turned to the atom. The meetings were discreet, often held late at night, under the weak yellow lights. Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Zhu De, and a few trusted generals gathered around a long table over which a map of China was spread. Mao pointed toward the northwest, his voice slow but firm. Desert, vast, desolate, sparsely populated, a good place to keep secrets. No one replied, but everyone understood. From that moment, Xinjiang, especially the Lop Nur region, was gradually marked in red on secret maps. It would become the heart of China's nuclear program, even though no one yet knew where to begin. While the leadership discussed strategy, behind the scenes, the scientific community quietly began preparing for something even they didn't fully comprehend. Qian Sancheng assembled a small group around him, young people, most of whom had never touched real nuclear equipment. They had only a few old French textbooks, some reprinted European lectures, and a shared belief that they were working on the most important mission in their country's history. Their laboratory was housed inside the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Day after day, they tinkered with measurements and experiments, even constructing models of nuclear fission with hand-blown glass tubes and recycled wires from discarded machines. No one knew whether the equations they scribbled on the blackboard would ever lead to an atomic bomb. But they believed that even a single correct step forward would bring the entire nation closer to equality with the rest of the world. Still, the scientists understood. Their knowledge was a thin shell. To build a real nuclear weapon, they needed what only a great power could provide: experience and technology. And at that time, there was only one viable source: the Soviet Union. The relationship between Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin was uneasy. Both men were proud, each convinced that he was the true leader of the global revolution. But Mao understood that if China was to move quickly, he would have to swallow his pride. Thus, in 1950, the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance was signed in Moscow. To the world, it was a declaration of camaraderie. To Mao, it was a ticket to the nuclear age. Soon after the treaty, thousands of Soviet experts began pouring into China: engineers, physicists, military specialists. They brought with them documents, blueprints, and equipment, from small reactors to radiation detectors. All of it was transported by train from Siberia to the Manchurian border, sealed inside freight cars that no one was allowed to open. On the crates was a single line: energy research equipment. But everyone knew this was the first drop of nuclear milk China would taste. When the first group of Soviet specialists arrived in Beijing, they were greeted with a mix of respect and curiosity. Chinese scientists, who had only known nuclear theory through books, now saw a real reactor for the first time, even if it was only a small model. To them, it was like glimpsing the future. The Soviets taught them how to calculate reaction cycles, how to handle uranium, how to control neutrons. Every detail was meticulously recorded. Every formula was copied by hand. Late into the night, lights stayed on in the laboratories of Beijing. Qian Sancheng told his students, "We are learning everything from the beginning. But at least this time, we are learning for ourselves, not to serve others." Mao knew well that this was only the beginning, but it was a beginning with no return. He believed that the atomic bomb was not just a weapon, but a symbol of national power. In his speeches, Mao began speaking of national rejuvenation, of China standing shoulder to shoulder with the great powers. For the first time, he voiced the words that would become the guiding principle of the entire nuclear program. "We do not wish to be threatened. We must have something that makes others fear us." From that point on, every road of Chinese science led to a single destination: the atomic bomb. From scribbled equations on scraps of paper, from smoke-filled rooms and cramped laboratories, the dream of national revival had truly begun. But no one yet realized that behind the light of that first reactor loomed the shadows of ambition, isolation, and a race of life and death. To obtain its nuclear talisman, China would pay a price, not just in money, but in the very soul of an era. Late 1957. Beijing lay under a cold winter haze. In the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev was beginning to see China as a troublesome ally. Moscow had provided reactors, engineers, and blueprints, but China's astonishingly fast learning pace was starting to challenge the Soviet monopoly on nuclear knowledge. In closed-door meetings, Soviet advisors made blunt remarks. "They're learning too fast. If we don't keep control, they'll build the bomb themselves." In Beijing, Mao Zedong noticed the subtle but unmistakable shift in Moscow's attitude. Soviet experts began to shorten their teaching hours, and some critical equipment was suddenly withheld. To Mao, this was not mere coldness, it was a polite warning. If you want the bomb, you'll have to walk your own path. In the BNINR laboratory, Qian Sancheng and his team felt the tension grow daily. The formulas and technical drawings they had once received openly from the Soviets were now limited, with access strictly controlled. One evening, during a personal inspection of the laboratory, Mao looked around the room and said coldly, "If Moscow won't help us, we'll do it ourselves. We cannot depend on others. Not this time, not ever again." From that moment, both China's leadership and its scientific community adopted a new, fiercely independent stance. They would no longer follow Soviet instructions step by step. From now on, every success or failure would belong to China alone. Young engineers, who had grown accustomed to theoretical models and textbooks, now faced a harsh reality. They had to create actual nuclear energy under conditions of scarcity, without complete Soviet blueprints, and under immense political pressure. They knew that a single mistake could doom the entire program, and both Mao and the nation would bear the cost. In internal meetings, Mao repeatedly emphasized, "If we hesitate, others will wield these weapons first. If China does not rise, history will repeat itself, we will be threatened, divided, carved up. We will never allow that to happen again." On the Xinjiang frontier, uranium survey teams received orders to expand their operations. In Beijing, Qian Sancheng's group began calculating nuclear reaction cycles from scratch, without relying on Soviet blueprints. Everything was conducted in strict secrecy. Every step was dangerous. One small error could plunge the entire project into disaster. Late at night, the faint flicker of the small research reactor's light seemed to whisper a warning. A new power was being born, but with it came terrible risk. One engineer recalled, "We felt as if we were walking on thin ice. Beneath us was power, but if we slipped, an entire nation could sink." These warning signs only made Mao more determined. He didn't just want China to possess the atomic bomb. He wanted the entire program to be fully under Chinese control, free of any foreign hands. This gave rise to a new philosophy. If we must walk alone, we will. If a price must be paid, we will pay it. But we will never kneel. This was a historical turning point. China officially embarked on a path of nuclear self-reliance. As its relationship with the Soviet Union began to fracture, the light from the research reactor was no longer merely scientific illumination, it had become a symbol of national will. In the laboratory, Qian Sancheng looked at his students with eyes that mixed pride and deep concern. "We are standing on a precipice. One wrong step could mean the end. But if we get it right, we will make history." And from those first independent steps, China's dream of national revival became irrevocably intertwined with the atom. There was no turning back. Spring, 1958. Across the vast desert of Lop Nur, military convoys crawled slowly forward, pulling long rows of tightly sealed containers. Dust billowed into the air, the cracked earth trembled beneath their wheels. Here, in this desolate land where few dared to tread, China was preparing to build its first nuclear facility, a site that would determine the nation's future in both energy and power. In a meeting room in Beijing, Mao Zedong studied the map, his finger pointing at the northwestern desert. His voice was low, even, but icy. "We will build this place out of nothing, to prove to the world that China bows to no one." For scientists like Qian Sancheng, Deng Jiaxuan, and their young team of engineers, this was a life-or-death moment. They were no longer merely learning or studying, they had to turn calculations on paper into physical reality. Every step had to be precise. A single error could destroy the entire facility or endanger local populations. Out on the desert, survey teams scoured the land for uranium deposits. They crossed sand, rock, and scorching sun, sometimes sleeping in tents through sandstorms, carrying soil samples back to laboratories. The initial testing methods were crude, but every result was meticulously recorded. These were the first entries in China's nuclear database. In Beijing, Qian's team worked through the night beside their small simulated reactor, blending what they had learned from the Soviets with their own calculations. Although the USSR had withheld key information, China began to redesign nuclear reaction cycles, develop plutonium production processes from scratch, and study uranium enrichment on its own. Each step was shrouded in secrecy. But in Mao's mind, they all pointed toward a single goal: China's own atomic bomb. Cabinet meetings grew increasingly urgent. Mao, Zhou Enlai, and the military leadership no longer discussed theory or formulas, they debated production processes, safety measures, testing sites, and classified information protocols. Mao's words echoed with national resolve. We are not doing this just for ourselves. We are doing it for history. And we will show the world, China has returned, strong and unshakable. During those days, a wave of nuclear enthusiasm swept across Beijing. Science students lined up to join laboratories. Workers in Shanghai eagerly helped manufacture uranium refining equipment. Engineers ceaselessly experimented with reaction models. Everyone understood. This was a historic mission. The atomic bomb was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of national self-reliance. Over the following months, the first desert facility began to take shape. Tents gave way to sturdy buildings. Water pipes, power lines, and storage bunkers were laid out. Teams of physicists, chemists, engineers, and mechanics worked together like a living machine, where any mistake could spell disaster, but every success marked a milestone in history. Mao occasionally visited the desert. He would stand atop a sandy hill, gazing at the clusters of buildings and tents where scientists, engineers, and workers labored. He stood in silence, eyes piercing through the dunes, his voice steady and cold. Even if we must eat grass, we will have the bomb. No one will ever threaten China again. It was a historic moment. The dream of national revival was stepping out of theory and into reality. From handwritten formulas, to uranium surveys, to the first bricks laid in the Xinjiang desert, China was rising, not just on maps, but in the realm of ultimate power, nuclear energy. But Mao and the scientists understood a chilling truth. Every success comes with danger. The power we hold carries immense responsibility. One misstep could destroy not just us, but the entire nation. The light from the simulated reactor illuminated the faces of Qian Sancheng, Deng Jiashen, and the young engineers, creating a scene both awe-inspiring and terrifying. In that moment, China was no longer a nation to be intimidated. It was becoming a country that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the world's great powers, through willpower, science, and the dream of national revival. Summer, 1959. Beijing burned under the summer sun, but the heat did nothing to ease the tension inside the secret laboratories and offices. On Mao Zedong's desk, neat stacks of folders detailed uranium surveys, reactor designs, and project progress reports. Mao gazed out the window toward Tiananmen Square, recalling the years when the nation had been carved up and humiliated. One question never left his mind. How can China ensure it will never bow its head again? Over the years, the nuclear dream had grown far beyond a scientific ambition. It had become a national declaration, a response to the world's insults, and a way for the Chinese people to stand tall in a world ruled by power. In the laboratory, Qian Sancheng and his team of young engineers carefully recorded data from their reactor model. The blue glow of simulated reactions illuminated their faces, creating a scene both solemn and almost otherworldly. Despite lacking many critical pieces of equipment and blueprints, they had learned to calculate reaction cycles independently, process nuclear materials themselves, and most importantly, to believe they could achieve what the world thought impossible for a country so recently scarred by war. Mao occasionally inspected the laboratories. He spoke little, but his eyes and gestures carried a single message. No one helps? Fine, we will build this ourselves. Out on the Xinjiang desert, Survey teams and construction engineers continued their relentless work on China's first nuclear facilities. Every brick, every pipeline, every uranium sample was inspected with care, because a single mistake could jeopardize the entire program. The echo of the revival dream was a blend of pride, fear, and unyielding determination. China had stepped out of the humiliating shadows of its past. But to truly stand shoulder to shoulder with the world's powers, it needed knowledge, technology, and absolute perseverance. In a closed meeting, Mao emphasized, "We are not just building a bomb. We are creating a symbol. Anyone who dares threaten China will have to face the power of this nation." The years 1945 to 1959 ended with a stark but resolute reality. China did not yet have the bomb. It did not yet have a fully operational nuclear complex. But the nuclear will had taken root in every seat of power, every laboratory, and every heart of the scientists and leaders involved. As the evening sun cast its light across the laboratory buildings and the Xinjiang desert, the entire nation seemed to breathe slowly but steadily, preparing for the next leap forward. The dream of national revival was no longer just rhetoric. It had become action, determination, and a clear answer to the world. China would never again bow before the atomic bomb. 1959. Beijing was engulfed in the early summer heat. Inside the laboratories, the simulated nuclear reactors continued to emit their silent blue glow. Chinese scientists, from Qian Sancheng to teams of young engineers, worked tirelessly. Every calculation, every experiment was carried out with absolute precision, because any error could derail the progress of the entire nation. Mao Zedong understood that the Soviet Union had begun to restrict its support. Moscow withheld crucial formulas and limited the transfer of sophisticated equipment and technology. In a closed meeting at Jiangnan, Mao looked around at the generals and scientists. His voice was low but firm. "If Moscow won't give it to us, we will build it ourselves. No power can stop China from rising. We must rely on our own strength." From this moment, self-reliance became the guiding principle of the entire nuclear program. Engineering teams began redesigning reactors, developing their own uranium refinement equipment, and planning independent test simulations. No longer dependent on Soviet blueprints or manuals, they reconstructed every formula and device from the ground up, relying on theory and hard-earned experience. In the Xinjiang desert, uranium survey teams expanded their search zones, transporting ore samples back to Beijing by truck, by ox cart, and even on their backs when roads were impassable. Every sample represented a small but crucial step forward, strengthening the material foundation for the day China would be able to produce plutonium and bomb-grade uranium. Inside the laboratories, students and young engineers didn't just learn, they invented solutions. They modified machinery, handled radioactive materials, and pushed the limits of their own knowledge. The blue glow from the simulated reactors shone on their tense yet determined faces. One engineer wrote in his diary, "Every step feels like walking on thin ice. One mistake and everything collapses. But if we walk it right, we will prove that China can stand tall among nations." Mao closely observed these developments. He understood that mastering nuclear science and technology was not only a strategic weapon, but also a tool to restore national dignity. He stressed in meetings, "We do not fear isolation. We do not fear challenges. We only fear missing the opportunity to rejuvenate our nation." By the final months of 1959, China's nuclear program was still in its infancy, but it had taken on a clear and stable structure. Theoretical and experimental research teams in Beijing, uranium survey and mining teams in Xinjiang, facilities for reactor simulations and material refinement. All of these units worked together like a living machine. Each step was fraught with risk, but also filled with hope, the hope that China would never again bow to the atomic bomb. The legacy of this stage was a powerful blend of anxiety, excitement, and absolute determination, laying the groundwork for the next historic leap. Building an actual nuclear reactor and refining plutonium, the first concrete steps toward possessing the atomic bomb. Late 1959. Beijing lay under the dry monsoon winds, blowing through streets still marked by the scars of war and poverty. but inside the laboratories and across the Xinjiang desert, where the first bricks of China's nuclear base were rising, the atmosphere was entirely different, intense, solemn, and charged with determination. Mao Zedong, standing before a vast map of China, fixed his gaze on the northwestern desert of Xinjiang. His voice was low and cold, but carried an unbreakable will. We have taken the first steps. Even without help, we move forward. Even if we must eat grass, we will build the bomb. China will never bow again. Scientists, engineers, workers, and young students looked at one another under the glow of the simulated reactor. Each understood. Every success demanded ultimate effort, and every mistake carried immense risk. They learned to calculate reactor cycles, refine uranium, and simulate reactors without full Soviet support. Each small step marked China's growing maturity on the nuclear path. In the Xinjiang desert, the first facility was gradually taking shape. The initial tents were replaced by sturdy buildings. Storage warehouses, pipelines, and preliminary laboratories began operating. Survey teams continued venturing deep into the desert, collecting uranium samples, calculating ore quality, and safeguarding research data. Every stone, every sample carried the nuclear hopes of the entire nation. The atmosphere of this period was a blend of pride, anxiety, and absolute resolve. China did not yet have the bomb. It had not yet tested a full reactor. But the nuclear will had taken root in every power structure, in the hearts of scientists, engineers, and leaders alike. Mao emphasized that this power was not merely a weapon, but a symbol of national sovereignty, a guarantee that China would never again be bullied. The final scene of Episode 1 is set at sunset over the Xinjiang desert. Laboratory buildings gleam with orange-red light, a silent but powerful reminder. The dream of national revival does not end here, it is preparing to enter a new phase. A phase in which China would confront the Soviet Union, the world, and its own capacity for self-reliance. The next steps: mastering technology, building real reactors, and preparing for the nation's first drops of nuclear milk.